Welcome to The Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's May 16th, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. Last week, we touched briefly on Kanye West's new song, Heil Hitler. We're going to expand upon that. So I want to give some background information on Kanye West. He's said outrageous, violent, obscene things for 2 decades plus. He claimed that George Bush doesn't care about black people in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In 2009, he took the stage at the MTV Video Music Awards when Taylor Swift was accepting an award. He ran onto the stage, grabbed the microphone, and claimed that Beyonce had one of the best music videos of all time and that she should have won. But despite all this, his music was praised. It was awarded, widely consumed. In the 2000s decade, Kanye West was the third best-selling rapper with approximately 21 million albums sold during the decade. He's won 24 Grammy Awards. But when he talked about all kinds of taboo subjects, violence, sexual things, outrageous behavior, and none of it really affected him in any meaningful way. And he was not a pariah. He went to all the top parties. He was widely respected in pop culture. But everything changed when he started talking about Jewish power, Jewish control, what he saw as Jewish control of the music industry. And he had made some comments about Jews all the way back in the 2000s. He had made some comments about how they controlled the music industry and basically keep black people under their control. And it was it didn't get a lot of attention, but here and there you would see certain things would leak out. And apparently Kanye West, this has come out more recently, but apparently for years Kanye West had been fascinated by the Nazis and their propaganda, and he's used lessons he's learned from Nazi propaganda in his own media and marketing. But it really burst into the open in about 2022. When he explicitly started talking about how he loves Hitler. And he got involved with Nick Fuentes and supposedly was going to run for president. And so I'm going to get back to Kanye West and his song Heil Hitler and the financial costs he suffered because of his what he's talked about with Jewish people. But first I want to give some background on hip-hop and rap. Since roughly the 1990s. And I just want to go through some artists and some of their lyrics that essentially got no significant pushback. The songs were not censored. They were widely available. Right now, in 2 seconds, you could go to YouTube and listen to any of these songs fully uncensored, read the lyrics. So I picked, and this is not just cherry picking. These are prominent, very famous artists, very famous songs. So I'm just going to go through a few of them. There's Eminem, of course. He had a song in Kill You from the year 2000, sample lyric. And forgive us for the foul language. We don't relish using these kinds of words, but it really is to make a point, to make hopefully a worthwhile, broader point. But Eminem, Kill You 2000 lyric, quote, "Slut, you think I won't choke no whore till the vocal cords don't work in her throat no more." And then we have Rick Ross. And again, these are all very well-known artists. He had a 2013 song called UOENO, sample lyric, quote, "Put Molly all in her champagne. She ain't even know it. I took her home and I enjoyed that. She ain't even know it." And then we have DMX, song called X is Coming from 1998, sample lyric, "If you got a daughter older than 15, I'ma rape her." Nicki Minaj had a song called Roman's Revenge in 2010, and actually she had a guest vocalist, Eminem again, sample lyric from Eminem on this Nicki Minaj song from 2010, quote, "I tied her arms and legs to the bed, set up the camera, and pissed twice on her." And so right now, blacks and white liberals are in the process of trying to place hip-hop, especially artists such as Tupac, Kendrick Lamar, Jay-Z, into the Western canon of great art. So they want to put these artists on the same level alongside artists like Mozart, Shakespeare, Homer. And some evidence of this attempt to insert hip-hop into the Western canon. In 2018, Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer Prize for Music. Tupac Shakur is studied in university literature and cultural studies courses, and Jay-Z's lyrics have been anthologized and analyzed as modern poetry. So that's some background. And again, I have to emphasize that the lyrics I picked are not, it's really not cherry picking. These are fairly representative of popular hip hop and rap songs. And so I wanted to give that context to examine why is Kanye West being so utterly censored and condemned for his song Heil Hitler. And so I'll give a little bit of background on what has been happening with Kanye West for the last few years. So in the wake of Kanye's increasingly vocal expressions on the role of Jewish people in the United States, and specifically in the music industry, Adidas ended its partnership with Kanye West, ceasing production of the Yeezy line. The decision had a huge impact on Kanye West's net worth, as the Adidas deal was valued at approximately $1.5 billion. Gap and Balenciaga both terminated their collaborations with Ye, and Creative Artist Agency, which is a talent agency, dropped Kanye West as a client, and other agencies distanced themselves from him. And so it's estimated that these collective actions resulted in Ye's removal from Forbes' billionaire list, with his net worth estimated to have dropped from nearly $2 billion to around $400 million. And then, in addition to losing business partnerships, Ye's banking relationship with J.P. Morgan Chase was terminated.
Man criticizes Jewish control of the financial sector and immediately gets debanked and loses $1.6 billion, proving just how utterly outrageous that assertion he made was.
The question I'm getting at with all this, why is the misogyny, the murder, the gang violence, the glorification of drug culture, why is that all permitted and celebrated, but simply having a song with nothing else relating really to Jews other than a single phrase, Heil Hitler? That is completely beyond the pale. That is the red line that you absolutely cannot cross. The hammer will come drop on you. It has to be censored. All the powers that be have to do everything in their power to prevent people from hearing that song. While again, at the same time, you try to look up Heil Hitler by Kanye, you're unsuccessful, but you can go listen to DMX and horrible. I consider playing the song, but Ness advised me we shouldn't, and I have to agree. But the songs are just vile, and those are easily accessible. So why is this the red line? And so, if you didn't know, the song Heil Hitler was released on May 8th, 2025. It's part of his upcoming album called Cuck, and the track has garnered significant controversy for its explicit, I suppose, glorification of Adolf Hitler and Nazi ideology, although I would quibble with that. I'm not sure it's explicitly glorifying it. Although the song does have a triumphalist, optimistic melody and tone while singing Heil Hitler, so I guess you could extrapolate that it's glorifying Adolf Hitler and Nazi ideology. And there is an excerpt from a Hitler speech towards the end of the song. And the imagery of the music video is quite striking. It's a group of black men standing in formation wearing animal skins and heads, chanting the song's refrain. This imagery has been interpreted as a provocative juxtaposition of African identity with Nazi symbolism, potentially aiming to shock and challenge viewers. And West has stated that his personal struggles, including custody battles and financial issues, contributed to his adoption of this controversial persona, referring to himself as a villain and a, quote, Nazi in the song. And so that brings you to another point. A lot of the ugly lyrics we referenced earlier are explained and I would say justified by people attempting again to put that sort of music in the Western canon. It's that kind of vulgarity is explained by, well, these often black people from difficult circumstances, they're just reflecting the environment that they grew up in. They're not necessarily glorifying it or saying it's something positive. They're just reflecting their upbringing, and they're expressing truthful truthful expressions of how they see the world, or people like Eminem. They have personas. The Slim Shady persona that he uses, with the words coming out of Eminem's mouth aren't necessarily him, Marshall Mathers, his views on the world. It's the persona he's adopting. I would say akin to an actor who plays a murderer in a movie isn't actually a murderer, and he's not saying being a murderer is a good thing. At least that's the explanation. But if you want to go with that explanation, I don't know why that wouldn't apply to Kanye West saying Heil Hitler. He's saying in the song, he says, the implication is, well, if everybody's going to call me a Nazi, I might as well lean into it. And so you call me a Nazi, yeah, I guess I am a Nazi. And it's a persona. And I think you could make that same argument, but again, this is beyond the pale. This is a persona you're not allowed to adopt. And so this song, again, it was released on May 8th, about a week ago. It's been removed from major streaming platforms such as Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and SoundCloud. I think you can't. So despite these removals, the song has gained significant traction on social media platforms. On X, aka Twitter, the music video amassed over 8.2 million views shortly after its release. And so users have circumvented these platform bans by re-uploading the track in various formats, including cover versions and embedded audio within podcasts. And it's just, all this has made it somewhat challenging for platforms to enforce complete removal. It's certainly a lot harder than it used to be.
I don't feel particularly confounded by why this is not permitted and the presumed misogyny and violence and other low-class dysfunctional behaviors being glorified were not castigated at all and were, as Jeff pointed out, have been celebrated and have been elevated, although I would characterize it not as these things being elevated, but as the things that existed prior being pulled down. However, it might be articulated effectively. What's happening is not that DMX is being lofted up to the same heights as Mozart or Pachelbel's Canon D, but instead that those things are being sullied and pulled down to exist at the same level, or to be perceived as existing at the same level, as all of culture is just this muddy mix of expression. Or at least that's the rhetorical cover. I think the underlying intention of all of this, the through line here, and we can tie this into why Kanye West is under so much fire here. The through line is that all of this is designed to pull down and destroy the legacy of the Occident, to pull down Heritage America, to pull down European values, to pull down Christianity, to pull down the idea of inhibiting one's most hedonistic, carnal desires. And by celebrating all of these things that the Western world was able to carve modernity out of avoiding giving in to all of these things and having guardrails set up against all of these destructive, dysfunctional behaviors, in tearing down those things, the edifice of the culture is coming down as well. And to the forces that feel this way, Nazi Germany in the 1930s was not the beginning of anti-Semitism. It wasn't the manifestation, an explosive manifestation of anti-Semitism suddenly bursting on the scene because of the brown shirts, because of Hitler and the Nazis. To the contrary, the historians of the 20th century look at Nazi Germany as the understandable, if not outright unavoidable, manifestation of centuries, millennia, hundreds and hundreds of even thousands of years of Western civilization. 400 years before Hitler, there was Martin Luther, who had views on the Jews that were not much different than the ones ascribed to Adolf Hitler. And 1,000 years before that was John Chrysostom, one of the most revered, renowned, important church fathers, a saint still today in the Catholic Church. And since the end of World War II, and really the onset of the civil rights era, we've been in what I'll refer to as the Nuremberg regime. And that Nuremberg regime looks at all of the behaviors associated with Western civilization as being inextricably tied up with the things that gave rise to the anti-Semitism that they perceive that goes back from Hitler to Luther to Chrysostom and everywhere in between. And this is not at all a paean to Adolf Hitler. That it's not my purpose. And when Jeff had mentioned that I advised against playing the song here while we played Kanye West's new single last week, it was because the Heil Hitler song from Kanye West, there is a novelty factor there. But as far as gangster rap goes, the lyrics and the sound will be instantly recognizable to anyone who has existed in American pop culture at all over the last 3 decades. And as for Kanye West's new album being entitled Cuck, I think that is funny, fitting, and I'm out of my cultural league in terms of my familiarity with him or with hip-hop, pop culture more generally, but my perception is that he feels that he has been cucked by the music industry and the broader culture. He perceived himself to be this maverick who was giving the middle finger to whoever it was that stood in his way and was not withholding anything to allow his artistic expression, to allow the muse within to say whatever he needed to do whatever he thought. He could stand up there and criticize the putatively most powerful man in the world, George W. Bush. He could rip away a moment from someone who was sort of an avatar of the all-American girl in Taylor Swift, and he was really sticking it to the man, or so that's how he perceived himself. That's what he perceived himself to be doing. But the reason he was allowed to do all that is because he was furthering the aims of the people he thought he was criticizing, the people who control the music industry, control all the cultural heights of the crumbling Western world post-Nuremberg regime. And it was not until finally he stepped away from that and said something that they didn't want him to say that everything came collapsing down. And he had realized that he thought he was his own man, saying his own things, making his own statements, his bold assertions, when in reality he was just being used. He was a cuck. To assuage my own insecurities about my lack of knowledge of popular culture, I will bring something that is germane to the topic that has to do with popular culture for reference here to add a little bit of levity before Jeff gets into heavier things.
Well, earlier this week, actor Marlon Brando met with Jewish leaders to apologize for comments he made on Larry King Live. Among them that, quote, Hollywood is run by Jews. The Jewish leaders accepted the actor's apology and announced that Brando is now free to work again.
Yeah, that was like our Reality Taboos version of a mid-album skit. Speaking of hip-hop albums, a lot of these hip-hop albums will have little interstitial skits throughout the in-between songs. So that's our version here. So another important aspect to this Kanye West story is his embrace of Christianity. Even back early in his career, he's been unusually outspoken about his Christian faith. Now, how genuine that faith is, I'm not sure, but he had a song, for instance, on his first album, College Dropout, called "Jesus Walks." It had Christian references. He actually had a song called "Jesus is King," or an album, in the last few years called "Jesus is King." That's been an important part of his identity, and so. I want to go into a little bit of a tangent here on Christianity and anti-Semitism. So the question here is Christianity inherently anti-Semitic? Now, Christianity has historically harbored strong anti-Judaic elements at the very least. Anti-Judaism is theological, seeing Judaism as a rejected faith. Antisemitism is racial or ethnic hatred, a more modern concept. And so the early Christian writings often painted Jews negatively and certainly laid the groundwork for future hostility. And of course, I would say laid a lot of the groundwork of Hitler and the Third Reich. So of course, this is just barely scratching the surface. So with that caveat, I just want to go through a few things that throughout Christian history and theology that could be viewed as anti-Semitic, perhaps. The phrase perfidious Jews was in the Catholic liturgy. It was a term that was in the Good Friday prayers up all the way until the 1960s when it was removed via Vatican II. And this was influenced by post-Holocaust theological reassessments as well as political factors. And so the question is, did Christians misunderstand Jews for centuries? So Christianity needed to define itself in contrast to Judaism, which led to theological hostility. So this could be boiled down to, is there a Jewish question, the JQ? Is there a Jewish question in Christianity? The continued existence of Jews was seen as a challenge to Christian truth. And so various thinkers interpreted this in different ways: punishment, blindness, and more recently, divine purpose. And so few of the early or major theologians addressed this question. So some of them we're going to look at briefly: Augustine, Aquinas, Martin Luther, and their views shaped Christian-Jewish relations for centuries. So starting with Origen, he lived in 185 to 253 A.D., influential early theologian. He allegorized the Hebrew Bible and framed Jewish rejection of Christ as spiritual blindness. He viewed Jews as rejecting the true meaning of Scripture. And then we have John Chrysostom, which Ness mentioned earlier. He was the Archbishop of Constantinople, lived 347 to 407 A.D. He delivered fierce anti-Jewish sermons. He had a sermon called Adversus Judaeos, or Against the Jews. He called synagogues brothels and dwelling places of demons. He was very influential in Eastern Christianity. We had St. Augustine, lived 354 to 430. He did oppose violence and forced conversion, but saw Jews as spiritually blind and under divine punishment. In his City of God work, he said, quote, "The Jews, by their own scriptures, bear witness to our Christian religion. Hence they are punished by God. They are dispersed, but they are not destroyed." We have Pope Innocent III, lived 1160 to 1216. He was a very powerful medieval pope. He did defend the Jews from physical harm, but he justified their inferior legal status. And he promoted the notion that Jews must live in visible servitude as a reminder of their rejection of Christ. Then we have Thomas Aquinas, and lived in the 1200s. Opposed coercion but justified restrictions. Believed that Jews should live in subordinate roles. He said, quote, in one of his works, "The Jews should not be compelled by violence to believe, but they should be under such a state of servitude that they may not be able to do anything against the Christian faith." And then lastly, we have Martin Luther, who lived 1483 to 1546. So Luther actually began hopeful. When in his younger years, he was hopeful for Jewish conversion, but he became hostile after disappointment. And so in his work on the Jews and their lies, written in 1543, he called for synagogues to be burned and Jewish homes destroyed. And his writing certainly directly influenced later anti-Jewish movements, including Nazi ideology. So quoting from Martin Luther's writings, quote, "Burn their synagogues and schools, break down and destroy their homes. They are a plague, a pestilence."
Jeff mentioned that the church fathers that he went through to briefly look at some of the things that they wrote and spoke about certainly laid the groundwork for the Nazi regime, millennia in the future. And from a Jewish perspective, that is an understandable take. From a believing Christian perspective, though, I think the perception would be that it was the Jewish behavior that laid the groundwork for the church fathers to extrapolate that behavior forward into the future. And it was, rather than spinning that anti-Semitism out of whole cloth, that they were instead noticing what they perceived to be patterns of Jewish behavior that went all the way back to the death and crucifixion of Christ. And so from a sola scriptura perspective, it is difficult to not perceive Christianity as being inherently antithetical to Judaism. And it goes beyond just the understandable idea that anything that makes specific, distinct, supernatural claims is going to be in opposition to any other competing claims to the contrary that would pit Christianity against any other world religion. If Christianity has certain precepts and certain tenets of the faith that have to be believed because they are true, well, any other religious or secular faith that denies those things is going to be antithetical to Christianity. But in the case of Judaism, Jews were in the position to welcome the Savior first, and instead of doing that, they killed Christ. If we fast forward now 2,000 years into the future, the idea of Christian Zionism might seem like a head scratcher, and from a historical Christian perspective, it is very much a new idea, this alliance between Judaism and Christianity. Indeed, the term Judeo-Christian was used for the first time, published for the first time in 1977, so within living memory of much of the population, and very much in the period of time post-civil rights, post-Nuremberg regime ascendancy to the cultural heights in the Western world. Harsh as the criticism over the centuries from church fathers towards Jews has been, the ultimate motive there and the frustration that came afterwards was in the desire to see Jews convert to the true Christian faith. It was not to sadistically persecute them or to punish them for what their ancestors had done in the past, but instead to get them to see the light and become converts. And Christian Zionism today doesn't seem to have that as an ultimate aim. It supports the idea of a Jewish state that is separate from Christian countries. So scripturally, that seems to make no sense, though it may be emotionally felt. I am skeptical that it is intellectually deep, that it can be apologized for in the debating term, the debating idea of the term apology. If I wanted to be magnanimous, I guess I could perceive it as being able to allow for the crusading impulse to have an outlet. It's not at all lost on the Islamic world that the modern state of Israel very much overlaps with the Kingdom of Jerusalem that was established in the 12th century, that existed for a couple hundred years in the Levant, that came about after the success of the first and to a lesser extent third crusades. And so maybe with the post-Nuremberg regime requiring that something to have any cultural weight has to be perceived as not anti-Semitic, well, this is by allying up with the Jews. This is the closest that modern Christians can come to rekindling the fires of the Crusades. But as I say that, it seems like quite a stretch, and I very much doubt that a lot of people have made that connection, although you do hear from time to time Christian Zionists use the old Latin phrase Deus Vult, and that was a Templar crusading call. And so maybe if I want to be charitable, I can make that tenuous connection. But outside of that, it just seems like there is no scriptural basis or any historical basis in the Christian church for 1900 years to make sense of the modern day Christian Zionists.
So we're going to look at some polling data on anti-Semitism and how different demographics and political affiliations, what they view as constituting anti-Semitism. And then we're also going to look at which group, which demographic exhibits the most anti-Semitic behavior.
To recline back to what we had talked about with Kanye West and the anti-Semitism that he expressed in the most recent single, it's easy to not be aware of it because the corporate media doesn't touch it, but there is a simmering sense of anti-Semitism in black communities in America that has existed for generations. And a lot of that energy that was or had been historically aimed at Jews has now been ported over to anger at whites, with the civil rights era trying to distinguish between Jews and non-Jewish whites. Although that distinction often gets blurred by blacks in America, it is something that cultural shaping institutions have worked hard to maintain since the onset of the civil rights era. But going back to, say, Al Sharpton in 1991, after the Crown Heights riots that came about in the wake of a boy being struck and killed by a Hasidic Jewish driver, where Al Sharpton led chants of no justice, no peace, and referring to Jews as diamond merchants, and allegedly saying that, quote, if the Jews want to get it on, tell them to pin their yarmulkes back and come over to my house, unquote. This is, for obvious reasons, not something that gets a lot of systematic prodding and inspection in the social literature, but in 1997, a survey of black Chicagoans, this is Diamond in the Rough survey that had a sample size of over 600, found that 38% of blacks living in Chicago believe that Jews were the primary financiers of the slave trade, and 33% agreed to the assertion that Jews are, quote, bloodsuckers, unquote. And earlier this month, the economist YouGov ran a poll that included 6 questions about perceived anti-Semitism. And though on those 6 questions, 3 of the questions, Trump voters were more likely to perceive certain behaviors as being anti-Semitic, and on 3 of the questions, Harris voters were more likely to perceive the behavior as being anti-Semitic. But on all 6 questions, blacks were the least likely to perceive as any behavior being anti-Semitic. They were the only group that bucked the partisan trends to instead, effectively, relative to non-black Americans, view all kinds of allegedly questionable behaviors as being just fine and not being problematic because they're anti-Semitic. And so it's not hard to read from that those sentiments that Al Sharpton expressed a generation ago and that Chicago survey found a generation ago, that they are still extant in the black community. And so that makes it also a little bit more understandable where Kanye West is coming from and why that might have some resonance among blacks. And those 6 questions briefly are, is it anti-Semitic to oppose the Israeli treatment of Palestinian people? Is it anti-Semitic to boycott Israeli products in protest of Israeli government policy? Is it anti-Semitic to cut off academic ties of American universities with Israeli universities? Is it anti-Semitic to deny that the Holocaust happened? Is it anti-Semitic to believe American Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the U.S.? And is it anti-Semitic or not to assert that Jews killed Jesus? And in all cases, blacks are less likely than any other group to perceive any of these things as being anti-Semitic. And the one that's probably the most explosive still in modern America is the idea of denying the Holocaust. And yet only 57% of blacks perceive that as inherently anti-Semitic. So almost half of blacks do not perceive denying the Holocaust as being inherently anti-Semitic. And that's compared to 71% of whites and 62% of Hispanics. And looking a little more deeply at that most potentially explosive question, the Holocaust as the looming largest historical event in the minds of Westerners, particularly in the minds of Americans, that is beginning to fray and fade away as everyone who was alive at the time during World War II dies out, and it becomes a historical fact that inherently isn't going to be as emotionally charged as something that happened within living memory. And we see that generationally with just 58% of those under the age of 30 saying that denying the Holocaust is inherently anti-Semitic, compared to 85% of those over the age of 65. So 85%, the vast majority of boomers, perceive questioning of the Holocaust as being anti-Semitic, while just barely over half of Zoomers feel that way. For completion's sake, too, I'll mention that the 3 behaviors that Republicans were more likely and Trump voters were more likely to perceive as anti-Semitic are opposing Israeli treatment of Palestinians, of boycotting Israeli products in protest of Israeli government policy, and of cutting off academic ties of American universities with Israeli universities, while Democrats and Harris voters were more likely to perceive denial of the Holocaust as being anti-Semitic, believing that American Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the U.S. as being anti-Semitic, and asserting that the Jews killed Jesus as being anti-Semitic. And in the spirit of looking at things that have shifted rather suddenly when contrasted to a long period of time preceding them, in the case of Christian Zionism being a break from Christianity's first 1900 years of existence, it's not totally outside the realm of possibility to me that we could be on the precipice of a reorientation in the way that Western cultural shaping institutions look at apartheid South Africa, specifically as it relates to the alleged apartheid that exists in Israel with regards to the Palestinians. I still think it more likely than not that this will not happen, but with South Africa bringing charges of apartheid, modern day apartheid against Israel, and Trump granting what has been highly controversial refugee status to a handful of white South Africans fleeing persecution in South Africa, coming to the United States and being criticized violently in many cases, instead of South Africa being perceived as a triumph of diversity and inclusion and democracy and neoliberal values. I could see the cultural shaping institutions on behalf of Israel looking instead at South Africa as a disaster, as it's not difficult to do using empirical data, looking at crime rates, poverty rates, infrastructure, food production, crime and corruption. South Africa is falling apart. And whatever one is to say about apartheid South Africa, it was a first world country. It was much nicer than the rest of the continent was, and that is increasingly no longer the case. And the parallels here with Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians become fairly obvious, where the current putatively apartheid state of Israel, while it might rub up against notions of democracy and neoliberal values, it is a nice functioning country now. And if all of Israel becomes like what the West Bank and Gaza are and becomes run and controlled democratically by Palestinians, it's not hard to see a future 30 years down the road where what was the current state of Israel is a much worse place to live. It functions much more poorly. It's more impoverished, and there's disease and corruption and all of these other problems that are now endemic in South Africa that weren't 30 years ago. And correspondingly, these problems that don't exist in Israel now could easily exist 30 years down the road. 30 years ago, when the apartheid regime in South Africa fell, the promise was one of multicultural pluralism in the future. Yet we fast forward to today, and we have the South African government harshly condemning the refugees that the Trump administration is granting asylum to as wanting to run away from, quote, accountability for historic privilege, unquote. That's 30 years. In America, we have a dynamic that is not entirely dissimilar, where we have 150 years after the abolition of slavery, we still have calls to mete out vengeance on whites today for something that happened over 150 years ago. And so the idea that this will ever be perceived as being ameliorated, being made good on, is sort of preposterous. it's there will never be a situation, there will never be a time where whites in South Africa will be free of perceived responsibility for everything that goes wrong with blacks in South Africa. And if a greater Palestine that incorporates the western end of Jordan and the Gaza Strip and the West Bank forms into a broader democratic political system in the Middle East, there is no way that Jews will ever be free of culpability and responsibility for everything that is wrong with the Palestinian underclass. Just as centuries later, whites in America are blamed as much, if not more so, as much as ever for all of the problems that non-whites experience. Notably, in 2018, during the first Trump administration, Trump first broached the idea of allowing white South Africans, farmers in particular, to be granted refugee status in America. The ADL came out hard against Trump, criticizing the administration multiple times. This time around, however, the ADL has had nothing to say about what has been very much a leading news story and something that the corporate media, which historically has been closely aligned, if not indistinguishable from the ADL. The corporate media has been making a stink about it. The ADL and AIPAC have had nothing to say.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk with you next time.